Well, hello, and welcome to this Berkeley Center webinar on Trump and the future of America's strategic religious engagement. My name is Judd Birdsall. I serve as a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown University. Over the past 35 years, across multiple Republican and Democratic administrations, the executive branch and Congress have created a wide range of mechanisms to help the US government have more capacity to, on the one hand, analyze and understand the complex role of religion in the world, and also to engage with religious organizations and faith-based groups in pursuit of America's diplomatic and defense and development objectives. That's essentially what's meant by this relatively recent term, strategic religious engagement, or SRE for short. So, for example, at the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is an independent, congressionally funded organization, there's been a religion team for over 35 years. At the State Department, there's been an Office of International Religious Freedom since 1998, and in 2013, Secretary John Kerry established the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, which was then rechristened Strategic Religious Engagement during the first Trump administration. At USAID, there's been a Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships since 2001 or 2002. But now, and those are just some examples of these mechanisms across the bureaucracy. But now with the second Trump administration's rapid and dramatic reductions and changes to the federal bureaucracy, much of that strategic religious engagement infrastructure is now gone, or it's been severely curtailed. And this also has cascading effects for religious groups, faith-based organizations that receive funding or collaborate in some way with these US government mechanisms. So to help us better understand what has happened and what are likely to be some of the longer-term ramifications, we've assembled an outstanding panel of experts who have served at the State Department, at USAID, at USIP, or in Peter Mandeville's case, all three of those, as well as think tanks, NGOs, religious organizations that regularly engage with the US government. I'll introduce our panelists just briefly, and if you want to, you can read more about them on our event page. Nicole Bibbins-Sadaka is the Kelly and David File Fellow at the George W. Bush Presidential Center. She previously served as Executive Vice President of Freedom House, was a professor of the practice in international affairs here at Georgetown, and she spent 10 years at the State Department, mostly focused on human rights and democracy issues. Catherine Marshall is professor of the practice in development, conflict, and religion, also here at Georgetown, the School of Foreign Service. She's a fellow at the Berkley Center, and she served for 35 years at the World Bank, where in the early 2000s, she led their faith and ethics initiative. Peter Mandeville was, until very recently, the director of USAID's faith-based office. He also previously served on the Religion and Peace Building team at USIP and at the State Department in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs and on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff. He's also a professor of government at George Mason University. Galen Carey is Vice President for Government Relations at the National Association of Evangelicals. He previously served for many years with World Relief, which is the relief and development arm of the NAE, and he served in Croatia, Mozambique, Kenya, Indonesia, and Burundi. And Susan Hayward is currently a minister at Creekside United Church of Christ in Minneapolis. She served in a variety of religion and international affairs capacities, including as the director of the religion unit at USIP and as associate director of the Religious Literacy and the Professions Initiative at Harvard Divinity School. A warm welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for joining in this conversation today. Just a few notes about the format of today's panel. I want our conversation to revolve around three different components of the challenge before us. First, I'll ask the panelists what has already happened in the last couple of months, particularly as it relates to America's strategic religious engagement capacity. Next, we'll discuss the medium-term ramifications of all this over the coming months and years. And then I'll ask the panelists, so what can we do about all of this, either during the Trump administration or beyond? And I want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for Q&A with you, the audience, and we'll conclude at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. If you have a question, you can type it up at any time by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please do be brief. in phrasing your question and let us know to whom you are addressing your question. This webinar is being recorded, and a captioned video will be posted on the Berkley Center website and on YouTube in a matter of days. Well, again, welcome to our audience. Thanks so much for joining. Thank you to our panelists for being willing to join us today and to share your insights. So the round one question for all of our panelists will be, what has already happened in the past couple of months at institutions that you are familiar with? Again, USAID, State Department, USIP, and then NGOs and think tanks that are also involved in this space of religious engagement. So Peter Mandeville, let me bring you in first. What has happened now at USAID and also within the broader interagency religious engagement space?
Great. Well, thanks very much, Judd, and greetings to everyone. I'm delighted to be able to share the virtual stage with a fantastic panel of friends and colleagues. So I think that many joining us today will be aware that there's been some very significant changes in the overall approach to foreign assistance with the current administration, much of which has, of course, centered on the U.S. Agency for International Development. By this point, some 83% of USAID's programmatic portfolio has been canceled. Much of the work has ground to a halt. And from the kind of human resources perspective, the agency has experienced a considerable reduction in force. We are still waiting to hear what this administration is going to do with foreign assistance overall, but we're starting to be able to glean some of the ideas that seem to be in the mix, and I'm sure and hope that Catherine Marshall will have more to say on this as well, given her extensive work in the development space. But what we're starting to see are the emerging contours of a plan that will see a significantly reduced version of USAID merged into the U.S. Department of State, perhaps the creation of a new bureau dedicated to humanitarian work. And that focus on humanitarian work is important to note, because I think one of the themes that we've been hearing with some consistency, albeit informally, from the new administration is the idea that the development side of things is likely to contract significantly, and U.S. foreign assistance going forward will primarily have a humanitarian focus, as well as the continuation of some health-related programs. Insofar as that broader shift bears on the issues we're discussing specifically today, more accurately, the question of U.S. capacity to engage religious actors and to work with faith partners in diplomacy and development, I think the broad headline here is that over the last couple of months, we have seen a significant, arguably approaching comprehensive removal of institutional capacity to engage with religious actors at the relevant institutions. Judd, you opened by mentioning the three governmental and quasi-governmental spaces where over the last 40 years we've been developing systematic capacity and experience and skills for engaging religion and diplomacy and development, more specifically USAID, State Department, and USIP. Well, when it comes to USAID, the reduction in force and restructuring of USAID that's occurred to this point effectively means that the agency's Center for Faith-Based Partnerships, which, as you mentioned, has been around since 2002, effectively no longer exists. At the State Department, the Strategic Religious Engagement Unit within the Office of International Religious Freedom, as I understand it, is in the process of being dissolved. It's not to say that the State Department's Religious Freedom Office won't continue to have religious engagement capacity to some degree in some form, but it seems that a dedicated focus on that issue or a dedicated shop or unit to that will likely no longer exist going forward. And of course, I'm sure many joining us today have been following the recent events at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and are aware of the existential precarity that that institute finds itself in today. I think on an aggregate, what this all sums up to is the broad idea that SRE capacity at large, institutionally speaking, is under a great deal of threat today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. Susan, I want to bring you in at this point. We've already now mentioned USIP a couple of times. It's a place where you served for many years, including as the director of its religion team. You wanted to share a little bit about what USIP does, what that religion team does, and its current status.
Yeah, happy to. And ditto to what Peter said. It's great to be with all of you, and the folks who are gathered here in this virtual platform are people I've worked with for decades in this space, and a testament to our long-standing, long-term connections across different political administrations, different political eras, and partisan affiliations. So it's great to be with all of you again. Um, USIP, I was at USIP with its religion program for 14 years until 2021. The Institute of Peace was established in 1984, as Judd mentioned, as by an act of Congress, and is congressionally funded. But it's an independent institution. It was created as such by the act of Congress that created it. Its oldest thematic program is actually its religion program. So the institute was created in 84. The religion program was established in 1987. So over 35 years, almost 40 years of doing this work of research and analysis at the intersection of religion, violence, nationalism, um, and peace building, and working with faith actors in that space. And it has also worked quite a bit with USAID, with State Department, with Defense Department, and with non-governmental organizations at home and overseas in doing this work. I say all of that because I think what's important, I'm going to come back to this, is that USIP has been um, I think, distinct in the landscape of the foreign policy world in Washington, D.C., in focusing on religion for a prolonged period and in a consistent manner across different administrations. The focus on strategic religious engagement or religious literacy at different agencies has sort of waxed and waned over those years. Sometimes the center of that focus has been at State Department, sometimes it's been at USAID. Sometimes the Defense Department has been advancing some of that, but it's been sometimes episodic. Versus at USIP, there has been a consistent approach to this over 38 years, and it has been able to sort of march on, in part because of its independent status, which means it's less susceptible to administration changes and so on, and can keep kind of mission focused and marching along in its work. As Peter alluded to, the Institute is in a place of existential precarity right now. And there was something of a dramatic showdown that folks might have followed in the news on Friday, March 14th. Well, first of all, in February, an executive order was passed that listed USIP as an institution that was going to be faced with some um, scrutiny to determine whether it would carry on. But then on March 14th, an administration official fired all 10 voting members of the board of the U.S. Institute of Peace. The board is Senate approved and is comprised of 5 voting members who are affiliated with the Democratic Party and 5 voting members who are affiliated with the Republican Party. As well as several ex officio members, which includes the Secretary of State, the President of the National Defense University, and the Secretary of Defense. So the 10 voting members were fired. And then the ex officio members, so Rubio, Garvin, and Hegseth, appointed a new president, dismissed the acting president of USIP, George Moose, who's been a longtime leader at the Institute and comes from a background in the State Department as an ambassador with an incredible legacy. They dismissed him and they appointed a new president, Kenneth Jackson, who's a State Department employee. And then they arrived at the Institute and sought to gain access. And at that point, there was a standoff a bit between the lawyers at the Institute and the leadership, who affirmed that the Institute is an independent organization and that they own the building, and the staff from the Department of Government Efficiency were not allowed entry into the building. Fast forward then to Monday, March 17th, and the staff of Doge returned along with Kenneth Jackson, and sought to gain entry again into the Institute. This time they had the support of the private security firm that USIP had employed in the past, but over the weekend they had severed their relationship with that private security firm out of concern that the private security firm had split loyalties. And so that private security firm no longer had the badges that gave them entry into the Institute, but there was still a key, the master key, that one of the staff people of that security firm had. And so they were able to access the building that way. The DC police were called. When the DC police arrived, they gave access to the building to the other members of the group from Doge and Kenneth Jackson who were there, and then the leadership, including George Moose, were made to vacate the building. So since that point, there is now a lawsuit that has moved forward that the members of the board who had been dismissed on March 14th, as well as George Moose and some others, have put forward to try to regain control over USIP, again, affirming its independent status. And the temporary restraining order that they had sought by the federal judge was denied, but the case is ongoing. The judge asked for further clarification, and the plaintiffs, in this case, the USIP folks who were sacked, are providing that clarification. So we'll see what happens. So we're kind of in a waiting period right now. At the moment, USIP staff are still not, some of them have been sacked, some of the leadership, but there are still plenty of staff who have not been given any indication, at least so far, that they will be sacked. But they don't have access to their internal Microsoft systems, emails, and so on, and they're still don't have access to the building itself. So we're in a bit of a waiting period. And I think the biggest concern for me, the takeaway, is of course what Peter said as well, the concern to the capacity that already exists. But particularly when it comes to USIP, one of the things I'm concerned about is that USIP has part of its strength in this space is that it's been an independent institution. And the degree to which it's been able to, its independent status, its nonpartisan status, has meant that it's been able to bring together people from the different political parties for discussions in a bipartisan manner and a nonpartisan manner. And I think that's threatened in this moment, as it seems as if the Institute of Peace's independence is being threatened to an extent, and it's becoming politicized. So I can say more about that in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. It's very helpful. Want to bring in Galen and Nicole and Catherine, who have spent considerable time either in NGOs or working very closely with NGOs over many years. Nicole, you've worked many years in government and many years outside of government. Curious as to what you've seen over the past couple of months and kind of what's at stake and what's going on.
Thanks, Judd, and thank you for convening this panel. I think it's a really timely one, and I'm really thankful to join old friends and colleagues from many years. I'll pick up on a term that Peter used, which is infrastructure, and I think that's where we have seen a lot of concern as far as the ability to work with faith groups and to work in some of the missions that faith groups that have been so extraordinarily effective in, which is the significant significant and rapid drop in foreign assistance has really crippled the capacity of a lot of major faith-based organizations to do the work that they were doing, to do sort of the compassionate work that they were doing to help, whether it's refugees or deliver health assistance and things like that. And even if we return to a place of the United States being able to provide that assistance, I think we have really hampered the infrastructure of those organizations, the institutional capacity and the knowledge and the connections that those organizations have with other people of faith in countries who are really on the front lines of delivering that assistance. So that's going to be a significant challenge going forward. I'll speak a little bit about the space that I've been in, which is the democracy and human rights space. Many organizations in that arena, including the one where I was most recently at, Freedom House, have really been hit in cuts on foreign assistance as well. And as we think about religious freedom, which is near and dear to the heart of many people in the United States, including those of us on this panel, and the ability to support the freedom of people, the human liberty of people around the world, these are the organizations who had that as their top mission. And it was really, for all of these organizations, their top mission was to help expand and defend freedom in other countries so that people of faith, people not faith, journalists, women, different groups were able to thrive and to live in freedom. A number of the groups really also worked directly to support faith-based actors in other countries. I know in Freedom House, we had emergency assistance that was directed specifically at people of faith who were facing persecution in authoritarianly governed countries, right? So in those countries where you've got a dictator who's got total control of power, they go after other centers of power. They go after people of faith. They go after people who are not of faith, who are not aligning with the regime. And we had emergency assistance that was going directly to those, to Afghan women who are running for office, or Iranian journalists, or a group of Baptists that have been under siege from criminal gangs in Latin America. Those groups, the assistance that we were providing to those groups has dried up. And so we also very much in this broader democracy community are thinking about how can the United States continue to stand with these partners that believe in liberty, to believe in freedom, and also are pushing for the values that we hold dear at home, which truthfully do make us more secure at home, make us more prosperous at home, keep us safe at home by allying with those partners around the world. That is all what really has been taken a severe hit over the last several months.
Thank you, Nicole. Galen, I'm curious as to what you've seen over the past couple of months at your perch at the National Association of Evangelicals, and given your proximity and familiarity with World Relief and other NGOs, what have you seen?
Yes, thank you, Judd, and thanks to the panelists. In the humanitarian space, there's been a fruitful long-term partnership between public and private actors, including faith-based groups. In fact, humanitarian work actually was done by faith-based groups long before the government entered the picture. So government is a relative latecomer in the field. But the capacities that public funding has brought has very much increased the reach and impact of the work of humanitarian faith-based actors. So what's happened in the last couple of months has been quite disruptive to that partnership and to the work of the agencies. They were told, most of them, to stop most of their work. And then later they were told, well, okay, if it's life-saving work, then it can go on. But some parts of it could go on. So, for example, perhaps food could be given, but the transport of the food from place to place might not have been covered, or the people who make sure that the food's given to the right people might not have been covered. So there were a lot of disruptions there, and a lot of uncertainty was created by this the back and forth, and then with the reduced capacity of the government representatives that were the points of contact, it was very difficult for many of them. That led then to, of course, quite a few layoffs and projects being canceled or at least paused, and that continues to this day. There have been some payments for past work done have been coming through in the last few days, but many organizations still face considerable cash flow crises because they operate on a very lean infrastructure and lean. They don't have endowments that carry them through lean periods. So that it's been very disruptive. But I think what I would highlight is the most impactful dimension for faith-based humanitarian operators has been the disruption of community relationships. Because where faith groups really shine is in the last mile service delivery. They're often the only actors, the civic organizations in villages and especially in rural areas. And so there are all sorts of programs underway that have been paused. And so promises that have been made to communities cannot now be fulfilled. And the local leaders who have also staked their reputations on endorsing the projects, they're also taking a hit. And that trust and relationship is not easily rebuilt. It takes a long time to develop, but it can be very rapidly damaged, and then the rebuilding process takes a long time. So I think the most important thing for a lot of the humanitarian groups is they need more certainty about what is going to happen, whether programs that have been paused will actually be able to continue, or if there's new mechanisms, what those are, and then how they can explain all of that to the people who are the end users, the beneficiaries, and the people who at the local level are supporting this work. So there's a lot to be concerned about, and a lot needs to be done.
Thanks, Gavin. And Catherine, want to get your thoughts on all this. In addition to the things that I mentioned about your bio, you're also the director of the World Faiths Development Dialogue and key leader in the G20 Interfaith Forum space. You're regularly engaging with faith communities as it relates to development and peace building and religious freedom. I'm curious as to what you've seen over the past couple of months, especially internationally.
Well, again, delighted to be with this very special group on one of the urgent topics that we're all, I think, concerned about. Over the past few weeks, I've traveled a lot. And so my comments really are reflecting, first of all, being in Geneva and really looking at it through the lens of the United Nations. Secondly, in the G20 context, particularly in South Africa and the African Union. And then third, a lot of contacts with people in the global health community, because the health programs have been deeply affected. And in general, in sort of the rest of the world, which of course is huge and we can't really oversimplify, there is a sense of bewilderment first, just what is happening and why and how did this come about. But I would also say the primary concern now is the effect on people. And some of the poorest people in the world have very suddenly lost their lifelines, lost food, medicines, and in many ways, hope. It's affecting education. It's affecting basic primary health care. The repercussions have moved very fast because of the suddenness and the breadth of the actions that have been taken. So that deep concern that we hear for the impact on people, HIV/AIDS patients who depend on medications to live, neonatal maternal health are some of the examples that people are citing. And then secondly, of course, it's a huge upheaval with people who think they've spent their lives working for the public good, for the common welfare, suddenly are not only without jobs, but their very being is under question. So I think that we're seeing, therefore, a lot of bewilderment, but also anger, of course, and concern, deep concern for where this is going. And I think, you know, the issue of how the religious communities, which are huge, we talk about 84% of the world's population has some religious affiliation. They're deeply involved in every aspect of humanitarian development, focusing on climate change. They're at the heart of these issues, but what they bring out is a reflection or a musing, a questing for what is the ethical foundation of what is happening. And therefore, I think it's called for some new thinking about what is the ethical foundation, what are the values of compassion, of caring, of a sense of the common good. Those are, I think, very central to the way that people are talking about it at the same time that they're concerned about critical, immediate issues. The one comment I would end with before we move on is that in many years, I hate to say it, but it's about 5 decades of working on international development. One lesson that I do take away is that it takes many years to build institutions and to build what we call capacity, but you can destroy it in a day. And we are seeing some of that um, severe immediate damage. Now, the people are still there, their motivations, their caring, their commitment to helping those in need, to helping to create the kind of opportunities that we know are possible in the modern world, where we know we can end poverty. They're still there, but the structures and even the knowledge base seems to be called into question.
Well, thank you, Catherine, and thanks to all of our panelists for sharing your observations and reflections on what's been going on the past couple of months. Much appreciated. In the interest of time, I want to get to our third component, which is kind of looking ahead. What do we do about all this? But I did want to just create a little bit of space for that second component that I had mentioned at the outset. What are likely to be some of the ramifications of the decisions that have already been made? We've gotten into this a little bit in your comments already. I jotted down ramifications related to capacity, obviously U.S. government capacity, the capacity of organizations that used to receive funding from the U.S. government that no longer have the staff, particularly as it relates to religious engagement, the credibility of the U.S. government as a partner and a funder, and the credibility then of organizations that used to receive funding and do work with it, the financial stability of organizations that received funding, and the overall organizational stability of organizations now that, as Galen mentioned, are on a daily basis having to figure out what's allowed, what's funded, what's not allowed. At some point, you know, different components of one kind of delivery mechanism in a humanitarian space. Anything else panelists might want to add in terms of ramifications over the coming months and years before we get to the what do we do about this question? And if you want to chime in that, yes, I see. Oh, okay, everybody. So might as well open up that one. So if you can, just be brief in your intervention here, and so that we can get to the what do we do question. But we'll go Susie, Galen, Nicole, and onward. Susie, over to you.
I also, folks mentioned trust, and I just want to dig into that a little bit more. It's not only building the capacity, and it's also building the relationships, and especially in violent conflict zones where there's often a deficit of trust between different organizations and actors and outside foreign actors as well. Building that trust is so key, and it takes time. And so having these disruptions right now is also a disruption of those really important relationships that have been built over a long time. And then seeing sort of the political and partisan nature of this also creates potential mistrust in what is the agenda of the US government, which is often a question, especially in violent conflict zones, especially in post-colonial contexts. There's can sometimes be a wariness on the part of some religious communities to working with US government entities or American NGOs. And so that trust becomes even more important. So I wanted to double down on that a little bit.
Galen.
Yeah, and in the humanitarian space, there's also been an impact of reductions in funding by other donors. the U.S. has been a leader in for decades, and the U.S. pulling back. We've also seen many of the European donors, some of them reducing their funding in order to spend more on their defense, which is also related to changes in our foreign policy. And then I also wanted to mention the impact on refugees coming to the U.S. That whole program has been stopped, and that's one of the, in my mind, one of the most profound public-private partnerships with faith-based organizations to welcome refugees. That's no longer happening.
Thank you. Nicole, and then Catherine.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on a point that Catherine mentioned about what are the principles that we're thinking about, and it sort of bridges this medium term to the long term. We're talking about how the infrastructure is being shifted around, but really at the end of the day, the question is, what are the principles that will guide American foreign policy, and how people then, to Susie's point, can trust what a partnership with the United States looks like. The United States has long been a country that is for freedom, religious freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of belief, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press. And that's what, despite all the challenges we had around the world, it's something that people have been able to trust that the United States fundamentally stands for. We've been able to stand for compassion around the world. The fact that our humanitarian community, as Galen said, existed for a long time before the government got in the game. We have always been a generous and compassionate nation that has cared for people around the world and welcomed some here, and then also cared for those, and a country that has spurred opportunity around the world. And so I think really that question of what are the principles that will underpin this next phase, the next 4 years, 10 years, 20 years, what are we for as a nation, I think is really going to be an important thing for all of us and our government and civil society to drill down on, because that will then define all of the other things which will define trust and partnership and institutions going forward.
Thanks,
And
Nicole.
again, very briefly, what brings us together is this question of what's religion got to do with it, and why does it matter, and how does that affect a policy? And there, I think we're really in a state of uncertainty as to what this means. We've made progress over the past, I would say, 25 years is my timeline, in helping the development and the humanitarian world, the climate world, et cetera, to have an appreciation for the complex religious ecosystem. In other words, all the work and the thinking and the commitment that volunteerism, that the Catholic Church, evangelical communities, mainline Protestant, Muslim communities, but also Buddhist, Hindu, et cetera, across the world, bring to the challenge of trying to deal with vulnerable communities, poverty, but also creating a better, more positive world. And I think that that's been more difficult than any of us anticipated 2.5, 3 decades ago. But there has been progress, but exactly where that stands in the thinking that's happening and in the actions, in the sort of actions that affect capacity, but also affect principles and trust, I think we still are very much in the dark as to how that will be carried forward.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you all. And in talking about ramifications, we've already gotten into the issue of what do we do about this. I want to leave some time for questions because we're getting lots of good ones in the chat now. If you have a question, feel free to post it there, and we'll hopefully get to it. As we transition to that conversation with the audience, any initial thoughts on what to do about this? Maybe very briefly, 1 point, minute or less from any of our panelists. Can this infrastructure, can this be rebuilt? Can the trust be rebuilt during the Trump administration? Or does this need to wait for a future administration? Is there a way to work with the America First agenda and making America stronger, safer, more prosperous? Or is that too difficult now, given all that's gone on in just the last couple of months? Any initial thoughts on that before we go to Q&A?
Well, I'll say it's hard to imagine how we could not re-engage if we're really trying to make a more stronger, more prosperous nation. It's critical because faith most people in the world are religious, and faith-based organizations play important roles. So yes, I think it's been a rocky couple of months, but I think there has to be ways to move forward, and I think I'm optimistic we'll see that, although I'm not exactly sure what it's going to look like.
Thanks, Galen.
I'll just echo Galen's comments as well. The United States as a nation is also about our civil society. It is about our people and the voices of our people, and many of them recognize the extraordinary importance of faith communities in their own community, in our nation, and in the world. And it's an opportunity for all of those people, and those, whether they are secular or people of faith, to really voice their opinion, both to the administration, to members of Congress, to local leaders that are elected, to journalists, to others, just to go back to what are those principles that will drive what people want to see our nation stand for. And I'm optimistic about the voice of the American people to engage our institutions and to really be able to lift up what those principles are that have guided our engagement with religious communities at home and abroad for so many decades.
I'll echo Madeleine Albright a little bit. I'm a cockeyed optimist who worries a lot. But I think that we do have really a lot of evidence that people are compassionate, that empathy is an important quality that's driven the American people. The one caution I would have is that, yes, there is a tendency right now to sort of say, nobody's understood what we've been doing. They don't know. And there is a lot of truth in that. But I think simply recalibrating messages is not going to take us very far. We need to do some thinking so that we understand better why this has happened, but also, as people say, never waste a crisis, and really look to ways in which we can do better going forward.
So I would add, I think that people have been rather surprised, and there's a kind of a question already I see asking about this. People have been surprised that so many of the actions recently, the early actions of the administration, have had a disproportionate effect on a lot of faith-based groups, certainly in the development humanitarian space. But I think also some of the question marks hanging over the State Department's work on human rights naturally poses some jeopardy to those of us who care about international religious freedom. I think the administration is going to see very soon that some of the constituencies that it cares about, and I think faith communities are part of that, are starting to feel that they are not being well served by some of these policies. So I think that's just a political reality that's likely to come. But kind of going forward, the optimism I have is really around the idea that there actually has been a fairly strong bipartisan consensus around religious engagement work over the years. The position I most recently served in at USAID, I think bears particular witness to that. In 2023, USAID under the Biden administration released a strategic religious engagement policy. First time the agency had ever had an official policy about why we work with faith actors. But the reality is that the process to write that policy started under the first Trump administration. Most of the language in it, a lot of the language in it, was drafted during the first Trump administration, which means that a Democratic administration received the policy architecture from the first Trump administration, looked at it, added some of its own flavors and colors, and then released it, right? And to me, there's hope in that in terms of the bipartisan consensus around this work.
Great, thank you all. And Peter, your comments just now are a good segue to some of the questions that we'll get into now. So Aaron Wilson, and we scroll down to another question that I saw here, which was related to it, by asking a question that I think is on many people's minds. And Peter, you just addressed this a bit. And that is, she says, I'm wondering if the members of the panel can untangle the justifications the administration is giving for dismantling so much of the religious engagement infrastructure, given that elements within the administration have emphasized their religious credentials, so to speak. This dismantling seems contradictory. And Peter, you said there could be a political price to pay for what's going on. Any comments on that, where you have a number of people in the administration who are very religious, who are very outspoken in their engagement with certain religious groups, and yet doing things to the U.S. government that would seem to be directly harming the government's religious engagement capacity and engagement with religious groups. Anyone want to take on that seeming discrepancy that we see in the Trump administration?
I mean, I'll just say that it is contradictory. I don't know that it's by design that these religious freedom programs and projects and strategic religious engagement capacities are being targeted. I think it's getting swept up with some of the desire, the proposed, desire to create efficiencies or to reduce bureaucracies or this kind of thing. I think, as Peter said, the reality of having taken these broad brushstrokes and cut some projects and some programs that are dear to many constituencies within the US and abroad who are concerned about issues like religious persecution, and human rights and humanitarianism. There's a lot of faith-based organizations that are involved in all of those spaces. So I think that might create a groundswell of concern, and we may see. I'm hopeful we may see some curling back of some of these cuts that were made. I also just want to make the point that the religion program at USIP, for example, has not been dismantled. It's sort of in a place of paralysis right now as they determine what's going to happen moving forward. But the staff still exists. The staff is still, to the extent they can, engaging with their partners and so on. So there is a potential that some of this work, like the strategic religious engagement policy work at USAID, or some of the work that the strategic religious engagement team at USAID at State Department had been doing, which was about religious literacy across the foreign policy portfolios of the U.S. government, can continue to move forward under the religion program at USIP. Depending on what happens there. So I'm optimistic about that. Also optimistic to what Nicole said, and speaking about the religion program at USIP specifically, the sort of world of scholarship and practice, that 38 years of work in that space that USIP has been able to cultivate, means that the kinds of tool guides that they created, analysis that they created, understanding of some of the best practices of religious engagement and peace building exists well beyond the Institute itself. And so I'm also optimistic that seeding of this work across many different arenas will help ensure that it continues to move forward in some way.
Thanks, Susie. Any others want to touch that subject?
Yeah, to Professor Wilson's specific question, basically the administration hasn't said anything specific about the dismantling of strategic religious engagement infrastructure capacity, because I don't think that the current administration is aware that it exists as a thing. It's admittedly, it's a rather niche area. The vast majority of Americans had no idea, for example, that USAID existed, much less that it had a Center for Faith-Based Partnerships in it. But one sign that there is some level of awareness on the administration lies in the fact that, as many of you may have seen, there was some reporting a few weeks back that the State Department held a meeting specifically with representatives of faith-based humanitarian organizations, not other sectors of humanitarian work, faith-based specifically. And that suggests to me that they had been feeling some pressure, that perhaps privately they had been receiving some expressions of grievance from groups whose support they otherwise counted on or took for granted. So maybe in that we're starting to see the beginnings of a response from the administration.
Thank you. I want to throw in a question I see from Richard Weeks, which I think also picks up on something that Catherine shared, a sense of bewilderment, but also this opportunity for rethink. I've seen online a lot of chatter about, maybe it's good that government is getting out of this business in some sense, and we should have the church or other religious organizations get more involved. I saw one person tabulate that you would need to have I think it was American Christians give 40 times more to charity if they were actually going to pick up the slack. But the question from Richard Weeks is, have organizations in this space been too dependent on government funding? How much is still possible with greatly reduced support from government? Galen, do you want to?
I like to speak to that. So in my work overseas, I administered programs that were totally privately funded, some of them were mainly publicly funded, and some that were a mix. And by far, I think the ones that were a mix had the highest quality because both sectors brought something to the table. So the public sector often brings accountability, metrics, evaluation, and things that are helpful to improving the impact of our work. But there's things that they leave off the table that private groups can bring, and oftentimes the faith perspective is an important component of a successful program. So what I would say is that even if private groups had 40 times as much money as we do, it would still be helpful and important to have a partnership with government, because government has convening authority and ability to make agreements with other governments that create a structure and a field in which its work can be done more effectively. So it's not an either or by any means. We certainly need both.
Thank you. Catherine and then Nicole.
I think one of the things we take away from the reactions is this sense, as the United States seems to be suddenly stepping back, of how important the American role has been and the values that it exemplifies of generosity and empathy, the things that we care about. So I think that is perhaps I don't know, a positive takeaway of both the role and the history, but also of the need. And there is a lot of reflection on that. I think we haven't alluded to one of the reasons that's being given for the sharp cutbacks, which is the sense that there is huge waste and huge corruption. And I think we really do need to push back on that, because I really find myself wondering, where are people getting these ideas? But the fact that so many organizations have folded within weeks suggests that they were working on very thin margins. They're not working with large cash deposits and a capacity to move. So there are so many evaluations, you can't even imagine how much has been written and questioned about every single aspect of the humanitarian development programs that exist. So I think that the people who work on all these areas, the people who've dedicated, let's be very clear, people have dedicated their lives to what they see as public service, driven by their religious motivations or by their sense of the common good. All of them, all of us have countless critiques and ideas, and we would love to see things made better. But the basic motivation for what this work does is very, very powerful. And I think it's a very strong element of the current rethinking, despair debates, and perhaps the sense of optimism.
Thanks, Catherine. Nicole.
Just briefly, it is obviously an opportunity to assess where are we and what does all of these industries look like. And I think it's an opportunity for the American people to dig in a bit more, because I think there is a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding about what is going on in the United States and what the cuts and the reforms have been about. It is also an opportunity, particularly for faith communities and others, to step up to say, if these are things that we care about overseas, then private giving is going to be part of the solution. But I do want to also flag that foreign aid is not this standalone industry that existed in order for NGOs to be able to have a source of funding. Foreign assistance has long been an arm of American foreign policy. And so, when President Bush started Faith-Based Office, he didn't start it just because he likes faith-based organizations. He started it because he recognized the value of engaging faith-based organizations in order for us to have a foreign policy where we are advancing freedom around the world, we are creating opportunity at home. All of the things are part of any president's legacy. The foreign assistance is the tail of the foreign policy. And I think that's why we also have to ask our questions of what do we want our foreign policy and what do we want the United States' presence around the world to be, and how does that foreign assistance then serve that? And I just want to put that out there because we can't separate this as if this is just a standalone slush fund that has nothing to do with all of the other elements of what the United States government stands for and is trying to advance in service of the American people and in service of a world that we want the United States to be a part of.
And to add to what Nicole's just said, there could be a much better articulation of all the many benefits that our foreign aid engagement has created and prosperity. You know, we have trading partners like Germany and Japan are good trading partners because we helped them after World War II, and that's been replicated in many places. The security, the health, you know, viruses don't respect international borders. So if we don't want diseases in our own country, it makes sense to help get rid of them in other places as well. That all those arguments, I mean, I think as a humanitarian, I think, and a person of faith, I don't say we only do this because it helps us, but it does help us in important ways, and that's part of the rationale to support it.
Thank you all. Well, just a few days ago, I had to email Peter, given that I had put USAID's Strategic Religious Engagement Policy document on my syllabus with a link to it, and that link is now broken. So there's a question related to that. This person asks, with the elimination of USAID, reduction in capacity at state, the attacks on USIP, much of the technical knowledge that these organizations have produced is no longer available online, as my students found out when clicking on that link. For example, that strategic religious engagement policy. What can be done or what is already being done to collect this knowledge elsewhere? How can we make sure that our partners, both in the US and in other countries, can continue to benefit from the decades of work that has been done in this area? Any ideas? And yeah, Susie.
Well, I think a lot of us, a lot of scholars in the field of religion and violence and peace, for example, have a lot of those documents already. And so if I'm hopeful that the USIP website will be back up and running again at some point, and those publications may still be available via the USIP website, but if not, I'm certain that all of those pieces are still available in one form or another. I think this sounds like a great task for the Berkley Center of Religion, Peace, and World Affairs to be able to collect some of those things. I know websites like Religion and Diplomacy, the Transatlantic Policy Network on Religion Diplomacy, which Judd knows very well, has also been a storehouse for some of these publications. But again, the programs that are represented by us here are not just housed at one academic center or institution or NGO or agency. They represent a wider family of scholars and practitioners who have been a part of shaping those publications and documents and tools and who have benefited from it. And so they exist beyond those particular institutions and agencies as well, and can be sustained through them.
Peter, did you want to join in on that?
I was going to say virtually exactly what Susie just said. I mean, this is a community. Yes, we're based at different institutions, but you know, we've all been doing this work together over the years. If there was ever a moment for solidarity, this is it. And I think there's a lot that non-governmental entities can do right now to help backstop the capacity that we're losing within the institutional spaces. And I think things like creating repositories of strategic religious engagement related documents that were at some point put out into the public domain. And so, you know, regardless of whether they represent the official positions of those institutions at the present moment, they were put out there and they're available. And I think pulling them together and making them and ensuring that they continue to be available is a very easy, low cost first step that we can all contribute to.
Thank you, Peter. Well, we've been able to get to some of our questions. Apologies for those of you who put forward really interesting questions that we didn't get to in our time together. One of you mentioned that this is more a marathon than a sprint in terms of all this work on religion and strategic religious engagement. And indeed, our conversation and the thinking about what to do now, I think, is also a marathon rather than a sprint. This is only the beginning. I think the conversation will very much continue in lots of different ways, and hopefully we've made a bit of a contribution here by bringing together this amazing panel. Thank you so much, Peter, Nicole, Catherine, Galen, Susie, for being with us today, sharing your observations, your insights, your hopes, your bewilderments. All those things are enormously valuable. Thank you to our audience for being with us and for posing many good questions to us. This video will be posted on our website and on YouTube soon, and I'm sure there'll be many more iterations to come in this marathon of religion and international affairs. Thank you all.